The street lay quiet under the cover of night, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people nodded politely at each other but rarely delved into deeper conversations. It was peaceful, predictable, and unassuming, exactly how Elijah Williams liked it. Elijah's home stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modest yet meticulously maintained house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a small American flag fluttering from the porch. Inside, the walls told a story few of his neighbors knew. Framed medals, photographs from deployments, and a folded military uniform hinted at a life of service, discipline, and sacrifice. Elijah was a retired Army officer, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and fought through it with unwavering resolve. Yet here, in this quiet suburb, he had found solace. Or so he thought. Unbeknownst to Elijah, a storm was brewing just a few blocks away. At a dimly lit garage on the other side of town, a group of men huddled around a battered table. Their voices were low, but the venom in their words was unmistakable. "Look at him," one of them sneered, slamming a grainy photo of Elijah's house onto the table. "Living it up like he owns the place. Thinks he's better than us just because he's got a nice house and a fancy car." The speaker was Travis, a wiry man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He was the ringleader, a man whose hatred burned bright and deep. His crew, a ragtag mix of petty criminals and malcontents, nodded in agreement, their expressions twisted with malice. "He's just another uppity punk," Travis continued, spitting on the floor for emphasis. "We're gonna show him his place. And we're gonna take everything he's got while we're at it." The others laughed, their jeers echoing through the garage. They didn't care about Elijah's history, his sacrifices, or the life he had built. To them, he was nothing more than a target, a black man in a nice house, and that was enough. They spent hours planning the heist, poring over blueprints and maps like it was a military operation. They talked about how they'd smash through the door, ransack the place, and make Elijah regret ever moving into their neighborhood. But what they didn't know was that their target wasn't an ordinary man. Elijah sat in his living room, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had a habit of staying up late, a relic of his years in the military when sleep was a luxury he couldn't always afford. The quiet hours of the night were his time to think, to reflect, and to prepare for whatever might come his way. Tonight, though, something felt off. His instincts, honed over decades of training and experience, prickled at the edges of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that danger was closer than it seemed. He glanced at the security monitors on his desk, scanning the live feeds from the cameras outside. Everything appeared normal, but the unease lingered. Elijah didn't know it yet, but his instincts were right. The men approached Elijah's house under the cover of darkness, their footsteps muffled by the grass. Travis led the way, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and hatred. In his mind, this was more than a robbery. It was a statement, a chance to put someone he despised in his place. They reached the front door, their tools glinting in the faint moonlight. Travis motioned for silence, then began working on the lock. It took only seconds before the door clicked open. Inside, Elijah heard the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but to him, it was as loud as a gunshot. He set his coffee down and rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He simply moved, his mind already calculating the best course of action. The men stepped inside, their laughter low and cruel. They thought they were in control, that this was just another easy score. But as they crept further into the house, they began to notice things, details that didn't fit the narrative they had built in their minds. The neatly arranged furniture, the lack of clutter, the faint scent of polish in the air. This wasn't the home of a man who was careless or weak. And then they saw it. A shadow moved in the hallway, quick and silent. One of them started, but his words were cut off as Elijah stepped into the light. He was unarmed, his hands empty, but his presence was commanding. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the intruders. "You picked the wrong house," Elijah said, his voice low and steady. For the first time that night, the men felt a flicker of doubt. They had come here to intimidate, to humiliate, to take what wasn't theirs. But now, standing in front of Elijah, they realized they had made a terrible mistake. And Elijah? He was just getting started. For a moment, the room was frozen in silence. The intruders stood like deer caught in headlights, their bravado evaporating under Elijah's piercing gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply stared at them, a quiet intensity radiating from his still frame. Travis was the first to recover, his sneer returning as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Look at this guy," he scoffed, stepping forward. "You think you're gonna scare us? You're outnumbered, old man." Elijah didn't respond. His silence was deliberate, calculated, a tactic he had used countless times in interrogation rooms and on the battlefield. He let the tension build, watching as unease began to creep across their faces. "What, you deaf?" another man barked, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to sound tough, but Elijah could hear the tremor in his words. Still, Elijah said nothing. The men spread out, their confidence slowly returning as they began to search the house. Travis barked orders, telling them to grab anything valuable. They rifled through drawers, pulled paintings off the walls, and overturned furniture, their actions growing more frantic by the second. But as they moved through the house, something felt wrong. The rooms were too clean, too organized. There were no signs of panic, no hurried attempts to hide valuables. It was as if Elijah had been expecting them. "Hey, boss," one of the men muttered, holding up a photo frame. It was a picture of Elijah in uniform, standing in front of a military vehicle. Medals gleamed on his chest, and a rifle was slung across his shoulder. "This guy's military." Travis snatched the frame and smashed it against the wall. "I don't care who he is," he snapped. "He's just another." A loud thud cut him off. The sound came from upstairs, a deliberate noise that sent a jolt of fear through the group. They froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. Travis waved his hand dismissively. "Probably just something falling over. Keep moving." But the others weren't so sure. Elijah moved silently through the shadows, his movements as precise as a predator stalking its prey. He had spent years training for moments like this, navigating hostile territory, staying one step ahead of the enemy. These men thought they were in control, but they were wrong. This was his house, his battlefield, and every step they took brought them closer to the trap he had set. He had already locked the doors and windows, cutting off their escape. The security cameras were recording everything, capturing their every move. And now it was time to turn the tables. Downstairs, the men regrouped in the living room, their nerves fraying. "This place is giving me the creeps," one of them muttered. "It's too quiet." Travis rolled his eyes. "You're acting like a bunch of kids. There's nothing to be scared of. He's just one guy." As if in response, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Elijah was standing at the edge of the room. The men spun around, their hearts pounding. "How did you?" one of them stammered, but Elijah cut him off. "Leave. No." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a promise of violence if they didn't comply. Travis laughed, though it sounded forced. "You think you can scare us? You're just one man." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "One man is all it takes." The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now a distant memory. Travis stepped forward, pulling a knife from his pocket. "You think you're tough, huh? Let's see how tough you are when." Before he could finish, Elijah moved. It happened so fast that the others barely registered it. One moment, Travis was standing tall, his knife glinting in the light. The next, he was on the floor, gasping for air as Elijah loomed over him. The remaining men backed away, their fear now fully realized. "Get him," one of them shouted, but none of them moved. Elijah's voice cut through the chaos, cold and unyielding. "You broke into the wrong house. And now, you're going to pay for it." The men scrambled to regroup, but Elijah was relentless. He moved through them like a force of nature, his years of training evident in every calculated strike. He didn't just fight. He dominated, dismantling their confidence and exposing their cowardice. By the time the police arrived, summoned by the silent alarm Elijah had triggered, the intruders were broken, physically and mentally. As they were led away in handcuffs, Travis glared at Elijah, his pride shattered. "You'll regret this," he spat. Elijah didn't respond. He simply watched as the men were taken away, his expression calm and resolute. This wasn't just a victory. It was a message, and Elijah knew they had heard it loud and clear. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The cul-de-sac, usually so quiet, was now a flurry of activity. Police cars lined the street, their lights flashing in rhythmic patterns, while curious neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. Elijah stood on his porch, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the scene with the precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. He had spent the last few hours recounting the events to the officers, his voice steady despite the chaos of the night before. Inside the house, forensic teams combed through the wreckage. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and the faint smell of fear lingered in the air. But amidst the destruction, one thing was clear: Elijah had not been a victim. He had been a force of reckoning. Across town, in a dimly lit interrogation room, Travis sat slumped in a chair. His face was bruised, his knuckles raw, and his pride in tatters. The other members of his crew were in similar states, their earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. Detective Karen Morales leaned against the wall, her sharp eyes fixed on Travis. She had seen plenty of men like him, arrogant, hateful, and utterly unprepared for the consequences of their actions. "So," she began, her voice calm but laced with steel, "you thought it'd be a good idea to break into a decorated army officer's house. Care to explain that brilliant plan?" Travis glared at her, his jaw tightening. "We didn't know who he was," he muttered. Morales raised an eyebrow. "And that makes it better? Or were you just looking for someone you thought wouldn't fight back?" He didn't answer. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Here's the thing, Travis. You didn't just pick the wrong house. You picked the wrong man. And now, you're going to answer for every single thing you did last night." Back at Elijah's house, the police chief approached him with a clipboard. "Mr. Williams, I just want to say, what you did was impressive. But you could have been seriously hurt. Elijah nodded, his expression calm. I've been in worse situations. The chief hesitated. We've been looking into these guys. They've got a history, petty crimes, vandalism, but nothing like this. Last night wasn't just about money, was it? Elijah's jaw tightened. He had known from the moment they stepped into his house what their true motives were. The hate in their eyes, the slurs muttered under their breath. It had been more than a robbery. It had been personal. No, he said finally. It wasn't about the money. The chief sighed. We'll make sure they face justice. But I have to ask, how did you stay so calm? Elijah's gaze drifted to the horizon. When you've seen what I've seen, you learn to focus on what matters. Staying calm isn't a choice. It's survival. That night, Elijah sat alone in his living room, the house eerily quiet. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. But as he stared at the shattered remnants of his home, a new feeling began to creep in, anger. Not at the men who had broken in. They were small-minded, hateful, and ultimately powerless. No, his anger was directed at the system that had allowed them to thrive, at the society that still harbored the kind of ignorance and hatred he had fought against his entire life. He thought about the medals on his wall, the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost. He had served his country with honor, only to come home and face an enemy he couldn't fight with weapons. But Elijah wasn't the type to back down. He picked up his phone and began to type, his fingers moving with purpose. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Meanwhile, news of the break-in began to spread. Social media buzzed with speculation and outrage as details of the incident leaked online. Some praised Elijah as a hero, a man who had stood his ground against hate. Others questioned why such hatred still existed in their community. The story took on a life of its own, sparking debates and conversations across the country. And while Elijah hadn't sought attention, he couldn't ignore the growing momentum. By the time he closed his eyes that night, his name was trending. But for Elijah, this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about something far deeper, a fight that had started long before those men had broken into his house. And he wasn't done fighting yet. The glow of the computer screen illuminated Elijah's face as he sat in his darkened study. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment before he typed another line. The email was addressed to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years but who might still have connections in the right places. Subject: Need assistance. Message: I have a situation. It's not over. Call me. Elijah hit send and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night pressing heavily on his shoulders. The events of the break-in had stirred something deep within him, memories he had spent years trying to bury. The next morning, Elijah woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. The name on the screen made his stomach tighten: Captain Sarah Monroe. He answered quickly. Sarah. Her voice was as sharp and commanding as he remembered. Elijah, I got your message. What's going on? He hesitated, glancing at the shattered remnants of his living room. I had a break-in. A group of men, racists. It wasn't just a robbery. They felt targeted. Sarah was silent for a moment. Are you okay? I handled it, he said simply. I don't doubt that. But if you're reaching out to me, you think there's more to this. Elijah nodded, even though she couldn't see him. They weren't amateurs. They knew how to move, how to work together. And the way they talked, it felt organized. Like they've done this before. Sarah's tone grew colder. You think it's part of something bigger? I do. And I need your help to find out who's pulling the strings. Later that day, Elijah received a package delivered by courier. Inside was a slim black laptop and a handwritten note from Sarah. Use this. Stay quiet. I'll be in touch. He powered up the laptop and found a secure communication platform already installed. Within minutes, a message from Sarah appeared. I've dug into the men who broke into your house. You were right. They're connected to a larger group. A hate network that's been growing in the shadows. They recruit online, spread propaganda, and target people they see as threats. You weren't a random target, Elijah. They knew who you were. Elijah's jaw tightened. What else do you know? He typed back. The leader is someone named Victor Kane. Ex-military, dishonorably discharged. He's been using his training to organize these groups, turning them into something more dangerous. He's smart, Elijah. And he's ruthless. Elijah stared at the name on the screen, his mind racing. Kane. The name stirred a faint memory, something from his own time in the service. But before he could place it, another message appeared. Be careful. If they targeted you once, they might try again. That night, Elijah sat in his living room, his senses on high alert. He had repaired the broken locks and reinforced the windows, but he knew that wouldn't stop someone like Kane. The hours dragged on, the silence of the house amplifying every creak and groan. Elijah's mind replayed the events of the break-in, analyzing every detail, every word the intruders had said. And then he heard it. A faint sound outside, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. It was the crunch of gravel underfoot, deliberate and slow. Elijah moved quickly, grabbing the small handgun he kept hidden in a drawer. He flicked off the lights and positioned himself near the front door, his breathing steady and controlled. The sound grew louder, closer. A shadow passed by the window, followed by another. Whoever they weren't trying to hide. The first knock came softly, almost polite. Elijah Williams, a voice called out. It was deep, calm, and unsettlingly confident. We know you're in there. Let's have a little chat. Elijah didn't respond. He stayed in the shadows, his grip on the gun tightening. The voice continued. You've made some powerful enemies, Elijah. And they don't like loose ends? A second voice chimed in, mocking and cruel. Come on, hero. Let's see how tough you really are. Elijah's mind worked quickly. These men weren't here to talk. They were here to send a message. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and two figures stormed inside. They moved with precision, their movements sharp and practiced. But Elijah was ready. He struck the first man before he even saw it coming, a swift blow to the throat that sent him crashing to the floor. The second man lunged at Elijah, but he sidestepped, using the momentum to send the intruder into the wall. The fight was brutal, a chaotic dance of fists and fury. Elijah's military training kicked in, his movements fluid and precise. But these men were no amateurs. They fought with the same ruthless efficiency, forcing Elijah to dig deep into his reserves. When the dust settled, the two men lay unconscious on the floor. Elijah stood over them, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloodied. He grabbed one of the men by the collar, dragging him into the light. Who sent you? He demanded. The man groaned, his face twisted in pain. Who? You're already dead. Kane's coming for you. Elijah's stomach dropped, the name hitting him like a blow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if Victor Kane was coming, Elijah knew he'd have to be ready for a war. The air was thick with anticipation, a silence so heavy it felt alive. Elijah stood in his darkened home, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. He had spent the past 2 days preparing for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. Victor Kane wouldn't send others to do his dirty work again. This time, he would come himself. Elijah had fortified the house, turning it into a fortress. Windows were reinforced with steel bars, tripwires lined the entry points, and cameras covered every angle. But more than that, Elijah had prepared himself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, and sending a message to those who thrived on hate. The first sign of their arrival was the low rumble of an engine. Elijah peered through the blinds and saw a black SUV creeping down the street, its headlights off. It stopped a few houses away, and 4 figures emerged, their movements swift and coordinated. Elijah's heart pounded, but his mind was calm, focused. He had faced worse odds before, in places far more hostile than this. The men fanned out, moving silently toward the house. One of them carried a crowbar, another a shotgun. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. And then, from the SUV, Victor Kane stepped out. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the man. Kane was taller than he remembered, his frame broader, but the cold, calculating eyes were the same. They had served together once, years ago, before Kane's dishonorable discharge. Back then, Kane had been a man of ambition, but also of cruelty, a man who thrived on power and control. Now, he was here, and he wasn't just seeking revenge. He was making a statement. The first man approached the front door, his crowbar poised to strike. As soon as he made contact, a loud snap echoed through the air. He screamed, clutching his leg as the tripwire-triggered bear trap clamped down on him. The others froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. "Stay calm," Kane barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "He's trying to scare us. Stick to the plan." But Elijah wasn't done. From his position upstairs, he activated another trap. A flashbang detonated near the back entrance, blinding and disorienting the 2 men who had been trying to sneak in. They stumbled, shouting in confusion, as Elijah descended the stairs. Kane watched, his expression unreadable, as Elijah emerged from the shadows. "Victor," Elijah said, his voice steady. Kane smirked. "Elijah, you always did have a flair for the dramatic." "This ends tonight," Elijah replied, his tone cold. Kane chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop me? Look around, Williams. This isn't just about you. It's about the message. People like you, thinking you can stand against us, it's pathetic." Elijah's jaw tightened. "People like me have been standing against people like you for generations. And we're still here." Kane's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Then let's finish this." The fight was brutal, a clash of 2 men who had once been brothers in arms but now stood on opposite sides of a war. Kane was strong, his movements precise and deadly, but Elijah was faster, his years of training and discipline giving him an edge. They exchanged blows, each strike fueled by years of anger and betrayal. Kane's men tried to intervene, but Elijah's traps kept them at bay, leaving the 2 former soldiers to settle their score. Finally, with a well-placed strike, Elijah sent Kane crashing to the floor. He stood over him, breathing heavily, his fist clenched. Kane looked up at him, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You can't stop what's coming." Elijah knelt down, his voice low and deadly. "What's coming doesn't scare me. Men like you thrive on fear, but I've faced worse than you. And I'm still standing." He pulled out his phone and called the police, his eyes never leaving Kane's. By the time the authorities arrived, the fight was over. Kane and his men were subdued, their weapons confiscated, their plans dismantled. As they were led away in handcuffs, Kane glared at Elijah one last time. "This isn't over," he growled. Elijah didn't respond. He simply watched as they were taken away, his expression calm and resolute. In the days that followed, Elijah's story spread. News outlets picked up the tale of the decorated army officer who had stood his ground against a hate-fueled attack. He became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that courage could stand against even the darkest of forces. But for Elijah, the fight wasn't over. He knew there were more like Cain out there, men who thrived on division and hatred. And he was ready for them, because this wasn't just about his home or his life. It was about something far bigger. And Elijah Williams wasn't done fighting yet.